Now, as I probably don't even need to tell you, almost every movie, book, TV show, and anything else that contains a coherent story, and some that don't even, usually has some kind of moral or message it's trying to convey. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially because that idea goes all the way back to the Greek myths. For instance, did you know the point of Achilles' story is that everybody has a weakness? But to stay on topic, the point is that when people write a story, it's usually because they have a message they want to send. Sure, maybe sometimes they just want to tell a story or just want to have some fun, but usually there's at least something they're trying to say. But what's just as important as whatever that message is how they say it, as I've even brought up in other videos. And today I'd like to discuss a movie that I believe didn't tackle its big moral as well as it could have, with that being the heist movie Fargo. But before I get too into it, I would just like to warn you that there will be major spoilers ahead for this movie, so you should probably click off the video now if you don't want anything spoiled. You have been warned. Okay, now to start off simply, the moral of this movie is stated very plainly by Frances McDormand's character Marge at the end of the movie as she takes Grimzerd into custody. There's more to life than a little money. And the rest of her speech only helps to drive this point home. Now listen, before you start running to the comments to tell me I'm crazy, please let me explain. Because I'm not saying that it isn't a well-written speech, that it doesn't get its point across, or that McDormand doesn't do a good job at delivering it. I'm not saying any of that. In fact, looking at it from a writer's perspective, I might even say it's quite a brilliant one. However, I think it was used on the wrong person. Because I've read a few analyses of this movie, and many have said that the final scene is only meant to punctuate the point about money. That the criminals and Jerry did horrible things to get their hands on more, only for them to either get killed or arrested and end up with nothing in the end. While Marge and her husband are quite happy with what they have and aren't looking for more. But the thing is, I feel that when you actually look at it that way, then her speech would have meant a lot more had it been directed at Jerry, because their situations are a lot more similar. He's also a family man that was undoubtedly doing just fine, but the difference between them was that he wanted more. So he tried to go out and get it, ended up getting himself caught in a tight spot, and went to extremely desperate and dangerous lengths to avoid paying the consequences for it. So for him to be told at the end, after he's been arrested and caused countless people to get killed because of his own greed, that there's more to life than money by a woman who's doing just fine herself and happy with what she has could have been a lot more impactful. Because the issue with it being delivered to Grimzerd instead is, we don't know anything about his situation. Sure, he's highly implied to just be a complete psychopath, but even if that's the case, I just don't think that speech would mean anything to him, and doesn't have as big an impact with it being delivered to him as a result. But there's also the possibility that he wasn't always the way he is. Who knows what could have driven him to that point? For all we know, he may not have any other talents or never had the ability to get other talents, and being a hitman is the only thing he knows how to do, and therefore would make all the more sense that he would do all these horrible things just to get his hands on some cash. Now, once again, the narrative does try to imply that he's only motivated by greed, but because of the ambiguous nature of the character, you really can't say that for certain. Now, what I'm trying to get at here is, Marge telling him that there's more to life than money could almost come across as hypocritical from his admittedly flawed perspective. Because if he doesn't have the skills or means to get a legitimate job and has to turn to crime for decent money, then that means he doesn't have a stable source of income and might not even know when his next payday will be. Hence, if you're looking at it that way, you could almost understand why he'd go to the lengths he does to get as much of it as possible. And yet here he is being told by a woman with a clear source of income and rather talented with an obvious level of education and doing just fine for herself on top of that, all the while never having had a financial crisis of any kind where she'd have to decide what the most important things in her life are, that money isn't the most important thing in life. And sure, money is not worth killing or getting people killed over in any situation, but you can still probably see how that speech can lose some of its impact if you're looking at it from that perspective. Because my point is, their lots in life don't match up. And even if she's still completely justified in saying what she does, I just don't think it carries the weight that the writers intended it to. If anything, that speech would have meant a lot more directed at Grimzerd if it had come from somebody in a similar situation as him, yet still chose to get a real job and live an honest life regardless of that. Because in that case, their lots in life would be the same. And therefore, what this person would say to him would mean a lot more. Because he could have chosen to turn to crime for money and live a better life, yet still decided to do the right thing because he felt his morals were more important than a profit. But of course, all of that is assuming that he couldn't have just gotten himself a regular job and didn't turn to crime out of greed. But as I've already said, because the character is deliberately written to be a closed book, as the saying goes, it leads to many different interpretations of his past and motivations, which as a consequence can make that final speech not work as well when you really stop and think about it. And of course, the other problem is that the movie would have to be majorly rewritten to have what I just said make sense. And that's why I think the speech would have worked better on Jerry. The movie wouldn't have needed to be nearly as rewritten, and it would have been a lot more appropriate. Because we know what his motivations are. We know he brought it all on himself. And we know he didn't have to do any of it and could have just been happy with what he had. Hence her speech, entirely intact and as written, would have meant something on a whole other level if directed at him. Because that would have really been able to drive home the point that he let his greed and need for money take over his life, and he should have just been more grateful for what he had, as this would have been told to him by a woman who's able to do those very things. Now listen, you can completely disagree with me and tell me I'm dead wrong all you want, but I'm just trying to look at this as objectively as possible. And I honestly do believe that from a thematic standpoint, it really should have been Jerry who was the target of that speech. But again, if you don't agree with me on that, I'm perfectly okay with that. And I've honestly got no problems with you if you do feel differently. But either way, my point is that context can be very important when it comes to speeches like that. And if you ask me, those still great writers, the Coen brothers, might have just missed out on an opportunity to make their movie even better by not considering that. Alright, that's all I have to say on that. So now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Marge's speech in Fargo would have been better had it been directed towards Sherry? Or do you think it's perfect just the way it is? Please feel free to tell me in the comments. And as I've already said, you don't have to agree with me on this. And if you don't, that's okay. I've got nothing against you. Thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.